Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand put out a statement last week calling a bombshell report flawed and saying Canada isn't arming Israel with weapons used in Gaza in its ongoing genocide of Palestinians. Well, a new parliamentary report just leaked that shows Canada actually has been exporting military goods to Israel. Yes, this is a new one, different from the other one I've been talking about lately. And now civil society organizations are demanding Prime Minister Mark Carney and Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand prove that Canada is not arming Israel. We're going to get into all of this, but first I want to give you some new context. Because Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, an alleged war criminal wanted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity, is mulling an illegal annexation of the Gaza Strip while Israel continues to starve more and more Palestinians to death through its illegal blockade of humanitarian aid. Trickles of aid have been allowed into Gaza through airdrops, which Palestinians have called, quote, humiliating, and which, according to Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, have killed Palestinians, including a nurse at Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital who was hit by an airdropped box of aid. Now, journalists have been allowed to go on some of these flights to document these aid drops, but were forbidden from filming out the window by Israel, who, according to reporting from Sky News, even went so far as to threaten to ban all food relief flights if journalists disobey them. Still, some journalists had the courage to expose these Israeli atrocities anyway. And now we've seen horrifying footage, thanks to ITV specifically, of the horrifying degree to which Israel has flattened and exterminated Gaza. Here's a clip from Emma Murphy's report.
Building by building, Gaza is being erased. Cities like broken skeletons laid waste by war. Graveyards of life and lives. The streets, homes and coffee houses of old now cast to the ground.
So it's in that context that this new report was made public recently after being leaked to the Canadian Muslim Public Affairs Council. This latest report is from the Library of Parliament. It was sent to all MPs and it confirms that 164 permits were used to export over $18 million in military goods directly to Israel in 2024 alone, plus 2 new permits issued. What's galling is this leak comes on the heels of the Foreign Affairs Minister responding to this other report that exposed Canadian arms exports to Israel by calling it, quote, flawed and, quote, misleading before asserting that, quote, we will not allow Canadian-made weapons to fuel this conflict in any way. The minister's statement, as I broke down in a recent video, then went on to refute claims that the report never actually made, all while refusing to explain the 391 documented military shipments from Canada to Israel. All of that is why civil society organizations are now demanding that the Canadian government prove that it isn't arming Israel, a demand they reiterated in a press conference here today. Here is a spokesperson from the Palestinian Youth Movement.
While Minister Anand lies to the public about which F-35 components and bullets the Canadian government deems lethal, Israel reaches a months-long starvation campaign in Gaza. Our elected officials are elected to represent us and to be accountable to us. They are not elected to hide government dealings with a country committing war crimes.
Now, I reached out to Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand's office on Sunday night and asked them about this latest Library of Parliament report, which shows that, once again, more than 160 permits were used to export over $18 million in military goods to Israel in 2024 alone, including 2 new permits issued. They sent me the following response, quote, the report distributed last month by the Library of Parliament was sent, I believe, to MPs from all parties. It was prepared at the request of 1 or more MPs as part of the usual services the LOP provides to aid MPs in their work. As you will see in the report, it is a compilation of previously released data. This information, as previously discussed, in no way contradicts any of the public statements we have made on the subject. I would point you to Minister Anand's statement on Friday. To be clear, however, we are not disputing the Library of Parliament's report, which factually compiles publicly available information. However, any interpretation interpretation of this report that suggests it contradicts previous government statements is incorrect. So consider what they just told us there. The government just told us that what is in this Library of Parliament report is true, and at the same time that it doesn't contradict previous government statements. So let's look again at that recent statement from Anita Anand. If you look closely at it, you'll notice a trend. Let me read you a couple lines. Quote, "Since January 2024, we have refused any new permits for controlled goods that could be used in Gaza." It also says, quote, "We went further by freezing all export permits in 2024 that could have allowed military components to be used in Gaza." And, quote, "Canada continues to deny any export permits for materials that could be used in Gaza." Finally, quote, "In other words, we will not allow Canadian-made weapons to fuel this conflict in any way." I want to know why they continually say, quote, "could be used in Gaza," and whether that is the wiggle room that they feel allows them to be technically correct in saying the parliamentary report doesn't contradict this statement. Because this export list details things like $2.3 million worth of Canadian military exports to Israel in 2024 under a category that reads, quote, "bombs, torpedoes, rockets, missiles, other explosive devices and charges and related accessories, components, and equipment." It also details $2.9 million worth of Canadian military exports to Israel in 2024 under the category that reads, quote, "aircraft, lighter than air vehicles, unmanned airborne vehicles, aero engines, and aircraft equipment and related equipment and components specifically designed or modified for military use." So is the government trying to tell us that Israel is telling them this stuff is only used, say, defensively within Israel or for non-Gaza related military operations? Like, as they mentioned to me last week, training. But training the IDF for what, though? Because if the government doesn't verify those claims, then their statement, to the best of their knowledge, could be true. But if that is the reason why the government feels these are two congruous documents, then they have to be able to prove it. They have to be able to verify it. Canadians don't want the government to just have plausible deniability in whether the military exports it's sending to Gaza are fueling this conflict. We want to know for a fact. If the government can honestly say that Canada isn't arming Israel, that these military exports aren't being used in Gaza, and it has a way to verify that, why isn't it sharing that information with the Canadian public? And if we don't have the capacity to know that these exports aren't being used in the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza, even as the government confirmed to me that the Library of Parliament export data is correct, then we actually don't know if the statement, quote, "we will not allow Canadian-made weapons to fuel this conflict in any way," is correct or incorrect. There's kind of the flip side of the plausible deniability there, right? I reached out to Alex Neve, the former Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada, about this latest Library of Parliament report. Now, at the time that I contacted him, he hadn't had the opportunity to dig into the specifics of this report, but he sent me the following comment about these broader questions with respect to Canada's role in military exports to Israel. Quote, "It is clear that whether and to what extent Canada is allowing military equipment and hardware to be sold or transferred to Israel remains shrouded in smoke and mirrors. Qualifications such as no new permits, the loophole of material going to Israel by way of the United States, or most recently, news that paintball-style projectiles, one assumes used for training purposes, are okay, make it very difficult to have any confidence in Minister Anand's assertion that, quote, "we will not allow Canadian-made weapons to fuel this conflict in any way. We need two things to happen immediately. First, Minister Anand needs to commit to an ironclad, comprehensive two-way ban on any arms sales or military or security cooperation of any nature with Israel, including indirectly through third countries. Second, an independent expert should be appointed to conduct a full review of sales of arms, weapons, and any military or security components or material between Canada and Israel since October 7, 2023. That review should, among other standards, examine Canada's compliance with obligations under the UN Arms Trade Treaty. The expert should be tasked with making recommendations for Canadian law, policy, and institutional reforms and should report publicly." If the government doesn't do those things, you have to wonder why it's refusing to give these clear answers, and what that tells us about its confidence when it comes to the question of whether Canadian military equipment is, in fact, fueling this genocide in any way. What do you think of all this?